Have you ever wondered how Russia can keep waging a full-scale war while under the heaviest sanctions in modern history? Billions frozen, banks cut off, all exports banned or capped. And yet, Putin's war machine keeps running. The missiles keep flying. So, where does the money come from? Here's the answer most people don't want to hear. It's floating on the sea. Thousands of miles away from the headlines, a ghost fleet of old tankers, unmarked, untraceable, and uninsured, carries Russian oil across the oceans. Oil that should have been stopped by sanctions, but instead quietly turns into blood money for the war in Ukraine. While working on my new novel, The Snow Queen Spring, which follows the human side of this war, I kept coming across something extraordinary. Hidden trade routes, strange ship movements, and oil records that did not add up. So I had to share it with you. I'm Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union. Today, we'll dive deep into the secret fleet keeping Putin's war alive. A criminal masterpiece that outsmarts the world's most powerful economies. Here's our roadmap. The art of deception. How Russia's culture of scheming became its greatest weapon. The sanctions. What the West tried to do and where it went wrong. The birth of the Shadow Fleet, how the operation was built in record time, the Vanishing Act, how Russian oil disappears on paper and resurfaces in other ports, the cops closing in, how the West is finally learning to fight back. Before we begin, if independent analysis matters to you, please like, share, and subscribe. You can also join my think tank, buy me a coffee, support via PayPal, or send a super thanks. All links are below. That's what allows this kind of reporting to exist without permission. Now, let's trace the lifeline of Putin's war, from oil barrel to blood. The art of deception. In Russia, many people grow up with a simple rule. The state is your enemy. It's not on your side. It may build roads and run schools, but at the same time, it's a force that can take away all your possessions simply because it wants them. It can punish you over nothing because it has the power. That feeling didn't appear yesterday. Under the Tsars, peasants learned to bow in public and bargain in private, so they wouldn't be ruined by taxes and conscription. In the Soviet years, people survived by trading favors and finding a friend who knew a friend. After 1991, the paperwork changed, but the reflex stayed. Life in Russia is formally governed by law, but in reality, the rules feel arbitrary. They don't apply to those who can find a way around. If a traffic cop stops you, you negotiate. If an inspector appears, you tidy the books for his eyes and keep the real account safe. If a clerk says no, you come back with a cousin who knows your supervisor. Over time, these small moves become a craft. You learn who can help you get around a rule and how to phrase a request so it sounds legal while doing what you need. That craft also has a moral logic. When the state is seen as a predator, cheating it doesn't feel like theft. It feels like self-defense. People trust their personal network more than institutions, so the network becomes the law that counts. Why does this matter for sanctions? Because habits transfer. If your first instinct is to rule around a rigid rule, you don't waste time debating the rule. You look for the shortcut that still works. You split responsibility so no single person holds the hot potato. It's the same muscle memory people used to survive under an oppressive government. When the West rolled out bans and caps, Russia didn't have to invent a culture of evasion. It reached for a well-worn toolkit. Personal networks over formal channels. A search for the window that's still open when the door is locked. That toolkit doesn't only build a shadow fleet, it also supports parallel import chains, currency workarounds, and quiet relabeling in other sectors. I have a dedicated video on how Russia evades sanctions. But tonight, we'll focus on one particular way of evasion, the shadow fleet. Before we move on to the next chapter, I want to recommend a book that captures this mindset perfectly. My novel, The White Ghost's Empire. It tells the story of a former Russian countess who ends up in China after the Bolshevik Revolution, without money, papers, or connections. Her only weapon is her gift for schematus, clever, daring schemes that turn every obstacle into an opportunity. To survive, she invents a fake Czechoslovak consulate and uses it to trade alcohol across borders, bypassing customs and outsmarting officials. It's a story about how survival and deception become two sides of the same coin. You can find The White Ghost's Empire on Amazon. The sanctions. After the war began, Europe faced an extremely difficult dilemma. On the one hand, a significant share of its energy needs was covered by Russia, which meant it could not simply cut ties without cutting off its own energy supply. After all, homes still had to be heated, and factories had to keep running. On the other hand, it became clear that Europe was, in effect, financing Russia's war machine with its own money. Leaving things as they were was no longer possible. It was obvious that Putin would not stop and that the old policy of appeasing the aggressor had failed. He had started by taking small bites out of his neighbors' territories. And each time he got away with it, he grew bolder, realizing that the global outcry would eventually fade and the world would return to business as usual. Perhaps the attitude toward Putin might have been different if Europe had not lived through the horrors of World War II, a war that began the same way, with a dictator who decided to seize neighboring lands, convinced that the West was too weak and too spoiled to defend itself. Everyone knows how such adventures end. In short, something had to be done. But direct participation in the war was out of the question. First, Russia had nuclear weapons, and provoking it was a terrifying prospect. Second, Europe had little with which to respond militarily. For decades, its security had been guaranteed by the United States, and Washington now made it clear that it saw no reason to keep spending American taxpayers' money to protect Europe. So Europe had to find another way. And the solution it chose was to put pressure on Putin through economic sanctions. Russia was not banned from selling oil completely. The sanctions package had two big parts. First, most of Europe stopped buying Russian oil for its own use. There was a ban on seaborne crude in December 2022 and another on oil products in February 2023. Second, for the barrels still going to the rest of the world, the G7 and the EU set a price cap. That cap said, if a shipment of Russian oil is priced above the limit, Western firms are not allowed to help move it. No tankers, no insurance, no financing or brokering. If the price is at or under the cap, those services are allowed. The numbers were simple on paper. For crude, the cap was set at $60 a barrel. For oil products, there were two caps. One higher, around $100 for expensive fuels like jet. One lower, $45 for cheaper stuff like fuel oil. Europe's own embargo meant EU buyers were out either way. But the cap mattered for non-EU traders because Western shipping and insurance dominate the seas. The idea was to use that choke point without blowing up the global market. What did lawmakers expect? Two things at once. Keep oil flowing so prices don't spike for everyone, and still drain the Kremlin's income. Let the barrels move, but force a discount. If Russia wants Western ships, Western insurance, and Western financing, the safest, cheapest tools, then the sale price has to sit at or under the cap. If it tries to sell higher, it loses access to those tools. Either way, Russia gets less oil money than it normally would. At first, it appeared that the sanctions had the desired effect. The EU was a huge market for Russian crude and refined products. In 2021, it bought over 3 million barrels per day. Over 40% of Russian oil exports went to Europe. Now, that pipeline was blocked. Only a few landlocked nations like Hungary and Slovakia were exempt from the embargo and still received small amounts of pipeline crude. That was a mere fraction of pre-war volumes. Losing the EU market was meant as a punch to the Russian oil trade, and it landed as such. But the other part of sanctions did not work out as well. The West expected Russian companies to accept the new terms. Instead, they simply walked away. And there was no drop in Russian oil revenues outside Europe. In fact, they sell more than ever to China, to India, and other emerging markets. Even with a forced discount, the Kremlin keeps making solid profits. Why did this happen? Because Russia no longer relied on Western carriers to ship its oil to buyers. Instead, it created its own shadow fleet. The birth of the shadow fleet. When Europe closed its doors to Russian oil, Moscow had two choices: cut exports or build a new road. It chose the road. The job sounded impossible: move millions of barrels a day without the Western ships, insurers, and brokers that used to do it. But Russia did not start from zero. It had cash from high prices, state tools for insurance, and a long list of brokers who knew how to buy oil tankers fast. First, the state turned on an insurance backstop. In June 2022, Russia's national insurer, RNRC, stepped in to cover oil cargoes after big Western insurers stepped out. Without that promise, most ports won't touch a tanker. With it, ships could sail. That was the foundation. Second, Russia and the friendly traders went on a shopping spree for elderly ships. Starting late 2022, brokers tracked more than 100 tankers, many 15, 20 years old, changing hands to buyers linked to Russia or to new offshore companies. Prices for these grandpa ships jumped. Third, the state fleet quietly rebased. Sovcomflot, Russia's tanker champion, shifted dozens of vessels into a new management setup in Dubai. The idea was simple: operate through a jurisdiction and service ecosystem less exposed to EU, UK rules while keeping the ships working. That Dubai pivot became a model others followed. A seller in Greece or Norway finds a buyer's agent in Dubai or Hong Kong. Papers move through a Marshall Islands or Cook Islands company. Money clears. The ship gets new paint, a new name, and a new flag. All of this takes weeks, not years. And Russia had the money to pay for speed, the money it made in the era of high oil prices. It took the West quite a while to realize what was happening. At first, the spike in oil tanker sales was spotted by the media. Next, shipping data firms started mapping frequent ship-to-ship transfers of southern Greece, the Lanconian Gulf, and later near Malta and the Aegean Islands. That was where the Shadow Fleet operated. The Vanishing Act. How does the Shadow Fleet avoid getting caught in the act? Let's take a closer look. Oil leaves Russia with a Russian name tag. The Shadow Fleet must lose that tag before the oil reaches a buyer who cares. First move: hide the handoff. A small tanker loads oil at a Russian port. It sails out to a quiet patch of sea. There, it meets a bigger ship. At night, hose to hose, they move the oil across. Second move: blend the cargo. Mix a batch of Russian oil with oil from somewhere else. 50-50 or maybe 60-40. After blending, the papers can say mixed origin or name the last place the oil changed hands. The Russian part is still in there, just not alone anymore. Third move: rewrite the story. Every shipment travels with papers, bills of landing, invoices, and insurance. After the at-sea transfer, new documents are issued. They focus on the last step, not the first. Instead of loaded in Russia, it might say received ship-to-ship south of Greece, or loaded at Malta anchorage. That's how Greece or Malta becomes the origin in practice, even if it's not the true start. Sometimes the ship that took oil gets a new name painted on the hull. The company that owns it might change as well. The ship uses a flag registry that does not ask hard questions. It can be Gambia, Sierra Leone, or most recently, Oman. Then it buys insurance from a small provider that doesn't dig deep. It hires a trader in Dubai or Hong Kong who is not tied to Western banks. Each helper adds one more layer between the oil and the word Russia. Ships carry beacons that show where they are. Some shadowy vessels go dark for a few hours. Others broadcast fake positions. When the dots on the map are messy, it's harder for a buyer or a watchdog to say that's the Russian route. If a port starts checking documents more strictly, they shift to a new sea pocket. If one ship gets flagged, they rename it and use another. The operators don't need to be perfect. They just need to stay one step ahead of slow paperwork. If we keep following that oil from an off-coast transfer, we'll see it change some more ships. None of the bill of lading says Russian. Finally, a supertanker shows up in Tsingtao with 2 million barrels that passed through a string of ships and have clearly non-Russian origin, at least on paper. Now, what about the money? How does Russia get paid for the oil it doesn't legally own? The buyer is not allowed to pay in US dollars straight to a Russian bank, so everyone uses a site. The buyer sends the money to a bank in Dubai or Hong Kong. The account belongs to the Russian seller or to a company that works with the seller. Now, the cash is sitting in dirhams or yuan. From there, it goes through banking links that still connect to Russia, a partner bank, a branch, or an affiliate. Once the money reaches Russia, the company exchanges the foreign currency into rubles and pays taxes. The cops closing in. Once the Russian Shadow Fleet operation was discovered, the West began to counter it. At first, it looked like whack-a-mole. One fake registry exposed, 10 new routes opening. Then the rule book changed. In June 2024, the EU did something it hadn't done before. It named vessels one by one and barred them from ports and core maritime services for helping the trade circumvent the oil price cap or move illegal cargo. 27 ships went on that first list. with a clear warning about deceptive practices like going dark and doing ship-to-ship transfers. That turned a general sanction into a set of arrest warrants. The message spread. In January 2025, Washington rolled out a sweeping package that blacklisted more than 180 vessels tied to Russia's exports. London followed in May, announcing sanctions on up to 100 tankers it said were part of the shadow operation. Each move did the same thing: shrink the safe harbor. Owners learned that one sloppy voyage could strand a hull. There were sharper local tools too. Germany started demanding real insurance documents from eastbound tankers in the Baltic Straits. Greece kept issuing naval advisories that emptied popular transfer zones. Estonia and France tested the edges of enforcement with a single case: the 18-year-old crude carrier that bounced between detentions over a false flag. The crew waited at anchor while lawyers argued which country, if any, was on the stern. By October 2025, Brussels tightened the vice again. The 19th EU package added 117 more ships to the list, bringing the total to over 500 vessels subject to port and services bans. It also struck at the fleet's oxygen, reinsurance. Without it, many shadow policies collapse, and a single casualty can bankrupt an owner. In parallel, EU diplomats floated a maritime declaration to let member states coordinate inspections with flag registries so a suspect tanker can be checked before it falls across. Does this end the scheme? Not by itself. The shadow fleet survives in the gaps, but you can narrow those gaps. Make false flagging painful. Pre-authorize spot checks with willing registries. Keep the vessel list fresh so port bans follow the hull, not just the name. Treat insurance as a choke point. If a club can't provide cover, service stop. And use geography. Declare shadow-free zones around known transfer pockets, with boardings for serial offenders. The shadow fleet will still move, but it will move slower and risk more each mile, until it's no longer profitable. Now that you've seen how this invisible system fuels the war, you can understand why I couldn't keep it to myself. While writing my upcoming novel, The Snow Queen's Spring, I kept uncovering details like these, traces of how corruption, fear, and profit intertwine to keep Russia's war alive. The book explores these human stories behind the data, what it feels like to live in a world where truth itself becomes contraband. If you'd like to follow the progress of The Snow Queen's Spring and get first access to what I uncover as I write, subscribe to my newsletter. The link is in the description. And if this video made you think, please share it, like it, and subscribe. You can also join my think tank, buy me a coffee, support through PayPal, or send a super thanks under this video. That's what keeps this channel alive and allow me to keep telling these stories that powerful people would rather stay hidden. Thank you for watching and for helping knowledge travel where it's needed most.